America is industrializing, and industrializing meant giant factories and giant companies. But it also meant that only a few men owned these giant companies, and this gave them a ton of money and power. They used this money to buy politicians, who wrote policies that crushed workers, stopped regulation, and prevented competition. This gave these few men even more power, creating a vicious cycle that was getting harder and harder to stop. You couldn't just vote in a new president or senator to stop it. They were all controlled by the corporations anyway. But there was one man they couldn't control: Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive from New York, and Teddy was popular. He didn't need corporate donors. He could win elections himself. And in 1899, he became the governor of New York. This was a crisis for the corporate trusts. New York was the financial hub, and Teddy was regulating New York railroads, protecting workers, and cutting out corporate influence from state politics. Well, the Republican Party came up with a genius idea to fix this problem. The Republicans controlled the presidency. Their guy, President McKinley, was corporate approved. But McKinley's vice president passed away, so he needed a new one. Well, his re-election was coming up, and the Republicans asked Teddy Roosevelt to be the vice presidential candidate. This sounds like a promotion, but it really wasn't. The vice president did nothing, whereas the New York governor had real power. This was a move to take that power away from him, and put him in a useless role where he could yap away, while President McKinley could keep running the show like normal. Well, the two of them won the election, but after just 6 months of McKinley's new term, he got shot by an assassin. The assassin said that McKinley was the enemy of the good people, the good working people. Well, do you know what this meant? It meant that the Republican Party's genius plan that was supposed to neutralize the progressive Teddy Roosevelt completely backfired. Roosevelt wasn't just governor of New York. He was now president of the United States. And Roosevelt was here to wreak havoc. But how? He was just one man. One man who had to work with a corporate-owned Congress. One man who had to fight a system of dozens of corporate trusts which combined had more power than him. Well, he didn't attack every big business at once. If he did, they would probably form a united corporate front to take him down. But they never united, because Teddy Roosevelt strategically praised a few good corporations. He made it clear that it wasn't a crime for good corporations to just own a lot of factories. If you built up those factories through honest hard work, then great, you deserve them. But if you were abusive about it, that was the crime. Drawing this line in the sand meant that Teddy could divide and conquer the corporations using this line. The good corporations didn't want to unite with the bad ones. They wanted to preserve their good status. And some of the bad ones wanted to prove that they were good. This left just the bad ones who wouldn't budge, and they would have to be punished for it. So Teddy Roosevelt isolated the worst offender first, the offender that he had the strongest reasonable chance of beating in court, which was Northern Securities, an obvious railroad monopoly. So Roosevelt sued them, used his popularity to focus the public's anger on them, and the case went up to the Supreme Court. Well, even though Northern Securities was an obvious monopoly and the worst offender, the Supreme Court ruled just 5-4 to break up Northern Securities. If a single vote went the other way, history could look entirely differently today. But regardless, luckily for Roosevelt, he won. The nation was shocked. The system wasn't supposed to allow this to happen. Corporate trusts were panicking. This court case set a precedent. And with this precedent in his back pocket, Roosevelt filed 44 more antitrust lawsuits, won half of them, and knocked out some of the most powerful monopolies in the country, including Standard Oil and DuPont. Well, what about the corporate-controlled Congress? How did he deal with them? He played the game. This guy was a strategic mastermind. For example, one problem was that Standard Oil was paying the railroads only 9 cents a barrel. This wasn't supposed to be legal. They were supposed to pay the railroads 40 cents a barrel like everyone else. Well, do you want to know who this upset? Roosevelt, sure, but also the railroads. The railroads wanted to charge Standard Oil 40 cents a barrel. Standard Oil was just bullying them into accepting 9 cents. And Standard Oil was getting away with it because they owned some congressmen. Well, here's the thing. The railroads also own some congressmen. Neither of them should be owning any congressmen, of course. But Roosevelt used the railroads congressmen to get this act passed in Congress, which shut this practice down. Teddy Roosevelt used the corporations against the corporations to get corporate regulation passed. With so much momentum, some monopolies just surrendered before putting up a fight. US Steel offered to open their books, cooperate with Roosevelt, and do whatever it takes to not get sued. Roosevelt completely flipped the board. Presidents in the past were afraid of capital, But Teddy Roosevelt made capital afraid of him. This is why Teddy Roosevelt is personally my favorite American president of all time. At a time when the other elites were rigging the system and looting the country, Roosevelt chose to stand up to them, even though taking them down seemed impossible, and even though they were much more powerful than he was. He worked relentlessly, used brilliant strategy, and took great personal risk to bring them down, and he won.